All right, so I'm going to try to show the weeding process for this, and to give you an idea of scale, there is a set of micrometers in there, and that's 50 thousandths of an inch width, which is about a half millimeter, about 1 millimeter actually. So the trick is, when you're weeding, right here is, you can see the light reflecting off the surface. Now when I'm working, I'm going to be down below using another light to reflect off, but you want to get that reflection so that you can see exactly what you're grabbing, because you're dealing with such tiny things that if you grab even the tiniest bit of the piece you want to keep, it will rip it right off the page, and then you got to be real careful. The other key is really sharp, tiny tweezers. Now, I have big hands, but here's my fingers compared to these tweezers, so they're pretty tiny. So let's see if we can pull some of these pieces up. I'm also using magnifying lenses. So the first thing we'll pull up is the outside gap that separates the etched area from the blued area of the armor. Now we'll weed the main background area. Now this, I've done the artwork so that the little zigzag doesn't quite reach the border right here and here, so that way I can pull these things off in one piece. Sometimes I get a little closer. This is a blending piece for the bottom of the breastplate, or the back plate, excuse me. And it's normally I would do this in one full piece if I could, but given that I'm doing a transition from the main part of the back plate to the skirt, the lineup is a little tricky. Now this little feather hair right here is a result of the machine cutting a little double line on some of these cuts. So that's the other thing you have to work on, is making sure that your artwork is optimized for the cutting. Again, you're dealing with such tiny pieces that if you don't optimize the artwork, it makes this process just really hard. And there's a couple places on this piece that I learned from doing the one there on the left that probably not optimized perfectly, but given that I only need one of these, it's okay. Now again, getting the light reflected so I can see exactly where the cut lines are, so that I can grab as close to the corner as possible without grabbing the part that I actually want. The cutter, the vinyl cutter, is set up to overcut these pieces a little bit. So each time it ends a cut, it cuts just I think it's like a millimeter or a millimeter and a half further. And that way you make sure that the pieces are separated, because if they're not separated, when you start weeding these things off, especially with tiny things like this, it does not take very much of a stick between the part you want to pull off and the part you want to keep to really rip up the whole piece. And again, given this really fine detail, if it gets ripped up, it's very tedious to get it back onto the page in the original position it was. So you see I did a section of the more delicate piece, and there's another hair here. So sometimes when you're starting to weed, that end let go, but as you start to pull up, you'll see it starts to rip up the part you want. And if you're careful, you can get it to separate like that, and then lay the piece back down. Now when you have a piece like this, this is what I mean by optimizing. You see that I haven't quite made this so that it doesn't get caught up in one of these hooks. And I'll show you what I mean here. This piece free. So right, that piece there, for instance, or this piece here is even better. So that's what I mean by a hook. The piece you want to get rid of curls around in behind the part that you want to keep. So normally what I do here is normally make that line wider. This is pretty thin, and I might just pull that off and use a scrap from somewhere else or redraw that in later. But what I'll normally do is make a little tiny cut from here to here as a separate cut. That way when I peel this piece off, that middle piece comes out separately. Now, what I started to say earlier was when you start pulling from one direction and you see that it doesn't want to let up, what I'll often do is start from the other direction and start peeling it up. And you learn when you're doing really long pieces which side, which direction works better. And having done this a lot now, I've learned how to optimize the artwork. Now, this piece here was taken from an older drawing that I had done. The back plate was one of the first pieces of artwork I did like a year ago. And I did the back because the photograph I had of the back plate was almost square on to the back plate and flat. So it gave me a really good chance to sample what all this scroll work actually looked like. Now see, there's where I'm starting to pull up the strip. So I'll use an X-Acto knife, or sometimes once I get this started, that didn't go very long, I'll use my hand to pull it up, and I'll use the tweezers to pin it. So this is another really tricky area. This is you'll see how far in that goes, and that normally if I had a bunch of these strips to do, I would fix that so that I didn't have to deal with that every time I weeded. And there's another one down here, and they're really kind of a pain. But since I only have these two pieces to do to blend the back, I didn't bother to go back and correct it. So then what I'll do is I'll make sure that I tamp the pieces back down really well before I go in. And again, this is where the tricky part is. You got to get the light bounced off the back. So I make sure that I grab the piece that's in the center here and I peel it out, tamp it down. So there's a case where I've connected this piece and this piece, so this becomes a separate piece to take out. It makes it much, much easier with, again, dealing with these tiny, tiny pieces. And there's a case where got to use a knife. I might have grabbed something. There we go. So you see that piece slid off a little bit to the side. So again, before you tamp it down, just slide it back to the center. Now, every once in a while, you'll get a little piece that you know there's no way it's going to survive the etch process. Like some of these really thin lines, they're not going to survive. So what I'll do is I'll go in with my inking bottle that I put the dots in, and I'll draw additional vine lines down here. That's a pretty good thickness of line right there. This starts to get a little thin here, definitely too thin here. This is all really good up here. So what I should have done is, again, I should have thickened most of these lines. One of the problems with working in the computer is you zoom in so close that what you're seeing on camera here is, already 2 or 3 times as big on the computer screen. So, it's much closer, and it's very easy to lose track of exactly how tiny all these things are. And then, of course, you make the cut, you get the piece out and go, oh, well, that's not going to work. So I've learned that to do test prints with the printer before I cut something and figure out if I've got to thicken lines up. Once again, because some of this artwork was old, I sort of got lazy and didn't optimize as much as I probably should have. The other thing that happens is some of these artworks, like you'll see this one, so this is part of the original tapered. So here's I'll turn it right side up. So, well, actually, like this. That is right. So the back plate is here going up, and this is the skirt. So this is where the skirt transition is. So this piece is already on the back plate from here up. So what I did is I made this transition. So I took this piece, mirrored it onto the bottom, and using Corel Draw, it's like Adobe Illustrator. It's just a less expensive program, but it's just as complicated or complex. It'll do all sorts of things. What I did is I take and put the whole drawing in what they call an envelope, which is essentially a box that I can stretch around, and it'll distort these things, the shape that's inside the box. problem with distorting that shape is some of these really fine lines get distorted and you actually even start to overlap one another. So you really have to be careful and go in and recorrect this. The other thing you have to do is make sure that it doesn't get too cartoony and look like it's stretched. This one's not ideal, but it's not bad. And given that it's on the back plate on the skirt section, only the people watching this video are ever going to look at the armor and go, that's that piece he was talking about. Yeah, see, I'm having trouble while filming getting the light on this thing from the other source. There we go. So you have to be very careful. You can spend a whole bunch of time weeding one of these things and then screw it up in a second by grabbing the wrong thing and ripping up a whole section. Now, you can go in and splice pieces together, kind of like what I'm doing with this. I'm going to splice from about here down onto the piece that's already on the back plate, but it really would be a lot better if you didn't, you could do it in one piece. Sometimes you also have to be careful when you're laying the pieces over one another. Now, see, this is another thing that you got to be careful of. So somehow the actual vine that I want, you can see right there, isn't joined. So when I weed this piece, it wants to weed both sides, and it really helps to anchor. Wherever you can anchor pieces all together, it's much better. So you'll notice that I've made these artworks so there are no cuts. So this is all essentially one piece, except for the parts that I want to pull out, and those I try to make one piece. And it makes it easier because if they're not connected, you know, like this one right here was, when I start weeding this side, then it wants to pull up the whole thing. So a couple little tricks that I've learned after doing this a while. I'm also going to try to invent some sort of light that I can put down low and get very directional, because it is sometimes difficult to get the light, especially when filming now, so that I don't grab the wrong piece. And ones like that are nice when they peel right off and they do what they're supposed to. So here's another section where I separated it so that I wouldn't get an undercut, or maybe that was just too close to the edge. This one certainly is a centerpiece. So that's basically how you weed these things. I finished this one out. Then I'll show you how to put a clear lifting film, a transfer film. There's translucent, like paper-like material that I had been using, but the clear one is really nice because you can see exactly what you're doing. And then I can go in and, if I want, connect this with the etch. I just take some ink and ink that right up to the wall. I can go in and thicken up some of these lines. If I have other places where something's torn off and I need to replace it, I can go in and re-ink it. And, you know, again, given the size, I mean, here's a number 11 X-Acto knife blade and a handle, you know, to give you an idea how tiny this is. So that's how we do it.